sort of bullet point highlights of some of the main themes of the introductory chapter. I will be talking through these in a little more detail, and if I do happen to ask anyone for feedback, don't feel like you have to speak up, but do feel free to answer my questions if you care to. Also, don't hesitate to ask questions if you have them. Better to have your questions answered now than never, and perhaps pose problems for you later on. Any questions? Good, good. What is reasoning, folks? One of the first things that was, I should say, pointed out in the text is this concept of reasoning. What is it and why should we care about it? Yes?
The essential ingredient in problem solving.
Yeah, that's nice. And by the way, when we're talking about problem solving, we're talking about a wide array of different problems that can be solved through reasoning. You probably noted that you use reasoning in just about every area of study that you undertake. Mathematics. When you're asked to analyze texts, you will be using reasoning, albeit a slightly different kind of reasoning. But reasoning goes into so much of our daily lives. That's one of the main reasons why we ought to study it. Now, many students get the wrong idea about what an argument is before reading the chapter. Does anyone know what I mean by some students might have the wrong idea about how we're going to be using the term argument in here? Any takers? Yeah, Mr. Smith.
Could some people think that an argument's like having a conflict between another person?
Perfect. Yeah, many people when they hear an argument, they think this is a disagreement or conflict between two people. Now that is indeed another usage of the word argument. So you're technically not incorrect if you said that as an argument. But we are going to be talking about another kind of usage of the word argument here. And for most of the course, we will be looking at arguments and analyzing arguments. For our purposes, what is an argument and what is its role? For our purposes, what is an argument and what is its role? Mr. Smith?
Is an argument kind of like an opinion about something?
We're going to go a little bit more than that. Well, typically people make arguments regarding their opinions in order to do what?
Prove a point?
Yeah, in order to prove them or to defend them. An argument for our purposes pick up attendance at the end here. So for our purposes, an argument will contain a conclusion, or you can call it a thesis if you want. That is the position that you're going to take, and to use Mr. Smith's earlier answer, the person's opinion that he may want to defend might count as the conclusion of an argument. Now, to properly be called an argument, we should have whatever the position the person's taking, and it ought to be backed up by what?
A premise?
Yes.
A premise.
Thank you. To properly be called an argument, there ought to be the conclusion that the arguer wants us to draw and supporting reasons. And the term that you want to have in your data banks for these supporting reasons, we will call these premises. Now, more generically, folks, you might hear premises and conclusions also called statements. These are statements and these are statements, technically. So if you see that word, statement, technically premises are a kind of statement. So is the conclusion a kind of a statement. Now name, sir, again?
Cameron.
Cameron. Yeah, Cameron made the comment about implied premises. We'll get there. Yeah, in many cases, arguments will also contain implied premises. These are premises that are not explicitly stated, but the person making the argument assumes that you will read in those implied premises. So occasionally when we're looking at arguments, we may not just want to think about what the arguer has included. Sometimes we may also have to infer what the person has left out, assuming that those things would be understood by the reader. On a side note, it's probably wise not to assume too much about your readers, though. In other words, to make a good, clear argument, it pays to be, this word's not in the text, it pays to be explicit about your premises. Now this is what we mean by arguments. Now this is addressed by the chapter. It's also not likely to show up as a quiz or test question, but this is something I talked about a little bit on Friday. Why does it behoove us to get good at identifying and evaluating arguments? More than one good way to answer this question. Why is this sort of a practical area of study that we're undertaking? Jimmy?
You come to valid conclusions.
Yeah, that's nice. If we don't want to be deceived, if we want to come to conclusions that are reasonable and not just be seething balls of emotion who believe whatever happens to come along, it is wise to have a kit bag that can help you to evaluate whether or not particular arguments are well constructed. Now, Jimmy used that word valid. I will be coming back to that in a minute. And I think I talked about this on Friday a little bit. But many people use the word validity improperly in everyday discourse. And I don't blame my students for that. This is because we oftentimes do use words imprecisely. And I think I said this before. Many students, before they read this chapter and hear this little lecture, they think that the word valid is synonymous with truth. That's actually false. Validity is an issue of the argument's overall structure. If an argument is valid, we say that it is well constructed, such that if the premises that we plug into it are true, then we can draw the alleged conclusion. Now, more on that shortly. But anyway, he's right. One of the reasons why it behooves us to learn about logic is because it can help us, keep us from being deceived. It can also keep us what I like to call intellectually honest. If I'm going to hold to a particular point of view, I would like to believe that I've got good reasons for holding a particular point of view. And I'm getting slightly ahead of myself here, perhaps. But I am kind of old school when it comes to things like knowledge. I am not quite as postmodern as some of my compadres might be. I happen to still believe in this old-fashioned word called truth. You notice we're living in an age, how many of you know what I'm talking about? We're living in an age where a lot of people think that each person has his or her own truth, and that it's all just a matter of what? Yeah, a matter of perspective. And if you don't like what a person happens to say, it must be, therefore, false. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? That is about as wrong-headed as it gets, logically speaking. Simply because you might like to believe something does not mean that what you're believing is true. Simply because it does not conform with your way of looking at the world does not make a particular observation or statement false. And simply because you may like the conclusion of a particular argument, it does not make the argument valid, nor does it make the premises true. And this is one reason why some people don't necessarily like to do this kind of logic stuff. Because not only can it help you to determine whether or not somebody else's arguments are reasonable to hold or not, it might also be something that holds you accountable too. In other words, if somebody asks me to support why I hold a particular point of view, I'm going to have the burden of proof of presenting what I believe to be good reasons. And those good reasons ought not just to be my subjective preferences. Ought not just to be my subjective preferences. In other words, if an argument is a good one, it ought to be one that rational beings will find acceptable once they have gone through a process of reason analysis. Mr. Smith.
I was just going to add an example from earlier.
Please do.
Well, you actually had already said it.
Oh.
Basically to help us communicate our truths a little bit better.
Yeah. And in some cases, through analysis, we might end up finding out that our reasoning is actually flawed. And the fact is, if you do find out that your reasoning is flawed, intellectual honesty should lead you to, cliche alert here, going back to the old drawing board, as it were. In other words, to maintain intellectual honesty, you might be forced to rethink things, which is not a very easy thing to do. If you believe something all of your life and then you find out that there's reason to doubt it, intellectually starting over isn't very easy. Now, for those of you who read all the way to the end of the chapter, I was making an oblique reference to what the author called worldviews right there. If you read to the end of the chapter, the author explains this concept of worldviews. Our worldview is something like a lens for seeing reality. Your worldview will typically be made up of your most fundamental beliefs about what's true and what's false. Your system for evaluating your reality. Now, it turns out that our worldviews are incredibly entrenched because many of them are acculturated into us from the time when we're very young. And to use the author's easy example of a big component of a person's worldview, what is one word, what is one example that the author gives? I know Mr. Smith knows.
Religion.
Yeah, a person's religion is oftentimes a major component of a person's worldview. And one reason why that's a good example is most of the world's great religions, as they're called, tend to have what I like to call complete systems of explanation. Answers for those big questions that tend to matter very much to me. Who am I? Why am I here? How did we all get here? Why is there something rather than nothing? Where am I heading? And by the way, I'm speaking euphemistically there. When I say where am I heading, I'm talking about where am I going after I punch the final, life's final time clock. I mean, that's something that affects, many people are very, very concerned about things like death and what happens after that. Well, it turns out that many people's elements of their worldview conveniently has answers for most of life's big questions. And once you have these answers, or at least what you think are the right answers to life's big questions, people tend to be reluctant to do what with those answers? They tend to be reluctant to question. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say to see if they're logically sound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is sort of why, as the author of the text later puts, when you start to get into conversations with people about these life's big ticket items, it is sometimes difficult to have these kinds of arguments, because oftentimes people's emotions tend to get a little too involved in these kinds of things. And that's, of course, when people oftentimes, rather than think about things or get into a conversation, that's when people start to close off conversation. This is not in the text, but I'll sort of give you a couple of markers for what I'm talking, or examples, if you will. If a person says, well, yeah, that might be right, but that's your opinion. Well, that person has basically said, I'm done here. We're not going to talk about this any further. Nothing that you say will change my mind about this issue. And if you push it further, I'm going to be getting uncomfortable. Now, perhaps the person saying that might say that and a whole lot more. But those are some of the things that a statement like that would mean. Yeah, there are some issues that people really do not want to have these kinds of arguments about. And I'd argue many people would also say that perhaps logic ought not to be applied to these things. Now, I'll admit my colors are showing here. I happen to believe that logical analysis should probably be applied to pretty much what? Pretty much everything. It should probably be applied to pretty much everything. But why? Because if someone's going to ask you, well, what is your take on such and such? Well, guess what a good answer isn't? Hey man, it's just how I feel. Well, you're not likely to win anybody over with that kind of a premise. Because that premise is not even it's not a factual statement. It's a statement about your own inner orientation to a particular point of view. And granted, logically speaking, that shouldn't change anybody's mind intellectually. Is that a pretty good start? Yeah, the author has a nice little conversation about worldviews near the end of the chapter, but I thought that wasn't a bad spot to highlight that a little bit. Now, a couple words to put in your data banks here. Now, part of what you folks were asked to do for homework tonight, and you will be asked to do for some more homework upcoming, and this is going to be among the skills you will want to have tested yourself on before we completely leave this chapter. Don't worry, we're not leaving the chapter yet. But you are being asked to be able to evaluate short passages, first and foremost for you're going to be asked first and foremost, do we have an argument here? Well, in order to determine whether or not a short written passage is an argument or not, what you got to look for? What's that? Yeah, did you hear her? Just, do we have a premise and do we have a conclusion? In other words, see if we have the pieces of an argument. Now, folks, this is sometimes easier said than done. And admittedly, the textbook doesn't go into a lot of detail on this. Sort of mentions a few things and trucks along. And this is perhaps something that you've heard in another course of study where you discussed arguments and figuring out if you have one. Might be something you've done in an English class at some point. But unsurprisingly, one of the things to perhaps look for when you're trying to determine if there's an argument or not, are there any indicator words present? What kind of indicator words?
Therefore, if, because.
Yeah. You hear what Cameron says here? Ask yourself, do you see any fairly standard premise indicator words or standard conclusion indicator words? Now, standard conclusion indicator words include words such as therefore, so, consequently, or my favorite, in conclusion. In other words, if you see these words in an argumentative passage, you probably have someone attempting to make an argument. And those words I just mentioned are some of the most common conclusion indicator words. Premise indicator words famously include words like since and because. Even though those are not the only ones, those are among the common ones. Now, folks, very frequently you will find no clear premise or conclusion indicator words. But that doesn't mean that you don't have an argument. What advice is the student given in cases where there are indicator words? And this might not be much practical help. Ask yourself, even if there's no premise or conclusion indicator words, ask yourself if there's any place in the passage where words like therefore would actually seem to fit in logically. In other words, you may have to look into the overall context and see if there are any other clues that indicate whether or not somebody is trying to draw a conclusion or not. Now, we'll see some examples of these whenever we start to do homework, exercise review, and so forth. Probably not today, but we'll be spending some time with that on Wednesday, because at this point some of us don't have our textbooks yet, and I don't want to put anyone at that kind of serious disadvantage at this point. But yeah, I think I answered all those questions there. Good. 4. Couple of words I want you to have in your data banks that were introduced to you in the first chapter. You will also want to know them moving forward.